like I did last night.
Hello, good evening, and welcome to Planet America. I'm John Barron.
I'm Chaz the Chidolo, and John, it's finally here!
Yes, we're coming to you live from the fake Oval Office with all the very real results, Chaz.
And some slightly pre-recorded guests because it is the middle of the night in America at the moment and nobody's going to stay up, especially for us. Amongst the guests now in bed, we've got pollster Celinda Lake, Dr. Larry Sabato and Ford O'Connell. But first...
America's 2022 midterm elections are over. On the line today, control of the United States Senate, the House of Representatives and 36 state governorships. The Republicans needed just one Senate seat to take the majority, but that could well be out of reach. In the House, Republicans do look certain to take control away from Joe Biden's Democrats, but without the sweeping victories that many polls had predicted. The presidency itself was not on the ballot today, but this result will have a major impact on Joe Biden's ability to govern over the next 2 years nevertheless. Incoming Republican House Speaker Kevin McCarthy is looking on the bright side.
Now let me tell you, you're out late. But when you wake up tomorrow, we will be in the majority and Nancy Pelosi will be in the minority.
That much is true. The ABC's election analyst Casey Briggs has been looking at the very latest numbers for us. Casey, what can you tell us?
Right, John, well, America has voted, as you said. We just don't exactly know what they've all said just yet. Going into this election, the Senate was 50-50. As of 5 a.m. in Washington, D.C., the morning after the election, we are at 48-48. 4 seats still in doubt. What are those 4 seats? Well, let's have a look at the map. 4 of them being Wisconsin. Now, this is a state that is probably leaning toward the Republicans. I think for the purposes of our discussion here, let's just assume that one will go to the Republicans and Ron Johnson will be re-elected. There's not a lot more counting happening there. Not a projected winner yet, but definitely leaning that way. And then there are 3 quite tight races. We've got Nevada, 72.3% counted. Adam Laxalt is on 49.9 to the Democrat incumbent's 47.2. We then have the state of Arizona, 62.2% counted. Mark Kelly is ahead, 52.1% there. But that lead has actually been contracting a little bit as counting has continued. And then we have, well, the nail-biter from 2 years ago is turning out like it might be the nail-biter for tonight as well. Georgia, Reverend Raphael Warnock trying to defend that position in the Senate. He's got 49.4. Herschel Walker has 48.5. 97.9% counted. So there's not actually that many votes left here. But the key thing is neither of them are above 50%. And if none of them can get above 50%, this one goes to a runoff. So let's just return quickly to the chamber here. We have that 48-48. Let's just, for argument's sake, let's say that's a 49. That's Wisconsin. That makes us 3 more in doubt, which means we are left with those 3, Nevada, Georgia, Arizona. Both sides would need to get 2 to take control in the Senate. Remember, the Democrats need 50, the GOP would need 51 because of Kamala Harris's tiebreaker vote.
So Casey, just looking at those numbers you just said then, if Nevada, if the Republicans are in the lead there, they could well be at the end of that 50 and the Democrats be 49 going into this runoff. When are we going to find out whether that's the case? How long do you think
that is exactly it? I mean, maybe things will clarify themselves in the next day or 2, but remember 2 years ago, it took quite a long time for some of these states to report their numbers. And if these 2 go different ways, and we'll get a bit more clarity on those 2 in the coming days, if they go different ways, well then this one here becomes key. And that runoff, if it does indeed go to a runoff, is not for a month, which means we do not know who controls the Senate for a month. And I should just say, Chaz, there is the distinct possibility, this is one of the big results of the night, John Fetterman in Pennsylvania winning that Senate seat, depriving Dr. Oz of a spot in Congress and flipping Pennsylvania blue in the Senate. Distinctly possible that might flip, one of these ones might flip, and then the numbers are back to 50-50.
Yeah, and Casey, so the House at this stage, we're only tallying up on your screen the races that have already been declared, but it is looking as though it is going to end up much, much tighter than all of the predictions had suggested.
Yeah, I think a lot of the projections in the Senate are kind of maybe giving the Democrats the edge, and here I think the Republicans have the edge. The AP, Associated Press data that we're using, has the GOP on 199 seats. So to win a majority, they need to fill up all of these benches, plus a few of these. Not a red wave is what we're seeing, though. If it was a red wave, we would be well over there by now. This is a red ripple, a red murmur. We don't exactly know what the right adjective to describe it is yet, because we haven't got 64 of these seats in. There is still a little chance the Democrats might also just be able to scrape in enough seats to either make it a very, very finely balanced House, maybe get there. But yeah, you're right. The GOP are best placed to take control there.
Casey, thank you for the update. Now, let's get some hot takes from you, Chaz. What do you think the story of the night has been?
Okay, I got two. Number one, this was a good night for Joe Biden.
Even though he wasn't on the ballot?
Even though he wasn't on the ballot, because generally speaking, the president doesn't do so well in their first midterms. The average loss is 26 seats. This is almost certainly going to be well below that loss.
Obama lost 63, Trump lost 40.
Totally. And I don't think anyone saw that coming, this smaller loss. And if you look at the exit polls, you can see part of the reason why. These are CNN exit polls, which are going to get adjusted over time, but still. You can see in the brackets, the share there, if you add up the strongly approved and somewhat approved, that Joe Biden had 44% approval in this particular exit poll, which is more than he's been recently. But the really interesting thing, while that's not great, the interesting thing is the somewhat disapprove is 10%. Now, normally, the people who somewhat disapprove you do not vote for your party. But have a look next to that. 49% of the somewhat disapproves voted for the Democrats, and 45 less voted for the Republicans. Now, that is extremely unusual. That adds 5 points onto his approval rating, which puts him around the 50-point mark, which is the one part of the reason why Democrats have done so well. It's quite a surprise. We have known that happen in the past with Joe Biden, but it's stuck all the way to the election. And that is now a great result for first midterms. Also, I've got to say my second hot take is that the Democrats, they've vindicated on the abortion issue, because I trashed them. Everyone trashed them, saying, look at the polls. The most important issue
is the economy, stupid.
Is the economy.
Inflation.
Yeah, the economy, inflation. There was double, triple the amount of...
There were polls last week saying that 75% said the economy was their most important issue, and about 25% said abortion was the most important issue.
Look at the exit poll. Inflation, yes, number one on 35%, but abortion was on 25%, just behind. And crime, miles behind on 13%, which in most of the polls, crime was well above abortion. So if the exit poll is at all accurate, and we'll find out over time, that does explain why Democrats did surprisingly well, and in an unexpected way, which showed the rest of us that we were wrong.
Yeah, well, if Joe Biden is one of the biggest winners on the day, or at least one of the most relieved people in all the United States, I have to say that one Donald J. Trump is possibly the biggest loser, although he too was not on the ballot, because a number of the Trumpier candidates, and Donald Trump endorsed a lot of candidates, but in many ways, he was like the punter who puts the money on the horse in the final stretch. You know they're going to win, so you put the late bet on. In some races, though, Donald Trump, he was the kingmaker. Specifically, candidates like Mehmet Oz in Pennsylvania. If it hadn't been, that was a very, very tight primary that Mehmet Oz only won after a recount, and without Trump's endorsement, he would not have been the nominee. Well, he seems to have gone down like a sack of spuds. He was a close contest, but he was against a candidate who was fighting against health issues after suffering a stroke in May, John Fetterman, and that Mehmet Oz has lost by being cut from the same cloth as Donald Trump, a TV star turned first-time politician. That will be seen as a significant rebuke for Donald Trump. We'll talk more a little later about some of the people on the Republican side who can claim to be winners at Trump's expense tonight, but that is certainly one of them. The other key hot take for me today was that whether it was Democrats or Republicans, overall, incumbents had a very, very good night. You think about elections in Australia, the United Kingdom with a change of leadership there, but across Europe we've seen a number of significant anti-incumbent elections in the post-COVID period. Well, that was not the case in the United States today, despite everybody having something to complain about, whether it's the economy or the erosion of rights like abortion rights or voting rights or civil rights. Everybody's got something to say. I don't like the wrong track measures. We're all saying we don't like where the country is, and yet they said, but I like my member of Congress, I like my senator, I like my governor, whether they were Republican or Democrat. So apparently it was a good time to be in office.
This makes no sense to me at all. I've got to look at these exit polls over the next few weeks.
Yeah.
We'll have to come up with some explanation.
Lucky we got a few more shows left. Let's get another take. This one from Kadia Goba. She's a Congress reporter for Semaphore. She said that both the major parties have some important lessons to take away from today.
I think Democrats need to take away that, messaging on abortion and January 6th or democracy, it doesn't mean that much when you're talking to voters who are dealing with inflation. Republicans were very smart to constantly message on that. And let's not forget crime. Democrats, they failed in actually addressing people's concerns with crime. Or on the Republican side, I think they have a real problem with bringing out voters at this point. It probably has to do with people in the Republican Party still believing that the votes are or the elections are fraudulent. So until they can convince their voter base that it is important to go out, I think they're going to struggle.
Fascinating point that the way that, and we saw it last year in the Georgia runoff elections, where President Trump talking about voter fraud depressed Republican turnout and they lost those 2 Georgia Senate seats. If we're faced with another runoff election in Georgia in a month from now and Donald Trump and others are out there complaining about the way the election was conducted, it could backfire again.
I hope they'd learned their lesson by now.
You'd think so, but they didn't today. We did speak earlier to leading Democrat pollster and strategist Celinda Lake. She works on President Joe Biden's election campaign in 2020. And she told us that it was the issue of abortion that played a major role in motivating particularly younger female Democratic voters to get out and vote today.
Well, what's happened today is there's been no red wave. It's been a ripple. And if you think about structurally what was supposed to happen, we were supposed to lose 43 House seats and 5 Senate seats. And I think it's looking really good to retain control of the Senate by at least a vote or at least go into a runoff. And looking very, we're going to lose the House, but we're going to lose it by much less margin than 43 seats.
You just said 43 House seats and 5 Senate seats was what structurally should have happened. There's been a lot of post-mortems about the choice of running hard on abortion in particular. Is that what the numbers were saying before the Dobbs ruling back in June? That's what you were looking at, 43 House seats and 5 Senate seats?
If you just looked at traditional patterns with this job approval of the president, with less enthusiasm among Democrats, which happened before the Dobbs decision, and just the average loss, you would have predicted, the models all predicted 43 seats.
Celinda, at the risk of undermining the Democrats' collective sigh of relief, I wonder how much of this realistically is because you didn't have much a majority to lose in the first place, so we're not seeing the traditional big swing back for an incumbent party.
Actually, that's very astute, and too bad American commentators aren't as knowledgeable as you are, because that's right. I mean, the reality is those huge swings came when presidents brought in a huge number of seats, and then they rolled back out when people got dissatisfied. We didn't pick up any seats in 2020. And no Republican incumbent lost. And so there wasn't as much swing built in. And I think that's been something that's been really underestimated from the get-go.
So what was the logic of the last week of the campaign being dedicated so much to the democracy issue rather than, say, the Republicans are going to take your Social Security kind of issue? Presumably there was a logic to it, but the numbers weren't apparent, at least publicly. What was the logic behind it?
Well, I would say there were 2 things going on. First of all, I would say honestly that we talked about Social Security less than we should have. For such an old electorate, we should have been talking more about Social Security. It should have been part of our economic message. But at the end, it's not a mobilization message. That was a persuasion message. The people that we needed to mobilize were not senior citizens. 86% of senior citizens were headed to turn out to vote. What we needed to mobilize were young people, where only 24% were headed out to vote. Very, very motivated by January 6th, the democracy issue. That had been true in the data for a long time.
Celinda, is that to say that Gen Z was more motivated by abortion perhaps than when a lot of the media and pollsters were focusing on, well, how are suburban women in their 40s and 50s feeling about the abortion issue 5-6 months after Dobbs?
Well, the abortion issue, I think, played a major role. And it played a major role in terms of competing for suburban women. But it also played a major role in motivating particularly young women. We had record registration of young Democratic women, and they turned out to vote in Kansas. They turned out to vote for the choice initiatives in Michigan and Kentucky. It looks like we're headed to win both of those initiatives, and Vermont. So everywhere the issue was on the ballot, we won resoundingly. The interesting thing about the democracy issue, as abortion was waning a little bit with Democratic men, the democracy issue was really surging with Democratic men.
So, Linda, there's a long way to play out in the results, of course, but one thing that's already clear is Florida was quite a big win for Republicans. Now, Florida is an urban, diverse, Sunbelt state, which 4 years ago was an absolute 50-50. And you had a strong candidate in the Senate, at least, with Val Demings, who just got blown out of the water by 15 points. How's Florida become so red so quickly?
Because they had a horrible hurricane. And thanks to Democrats, frankly, the senators and the governor looked really good because we did not make that a partisan issue. So Ron DeSantis and Mark Rubio were able to deliver a tremendous amount of aid to their state, as they should have been. And in a crisis time like that, states move toward the incumbents. If anything, those people should be thanking the Democrats for having nonpartisanly delivered aid.
Celinda, for President Biden, if this is seen as a not too bad referendum, if not a pass mark, kind of a close fail, it will immediately be raising questions about his intentions for 2024. He's about to turn 80 later this month. Is he the best that Democrats can do?
He's the only one that has ever beat Donald Trump. And apparently, as of November 15th, we're going to have Donald Trump running again. So I think he's the best person to beat Donald Trump a second time.
My final question from today, Celinda, is if Georgia goes to a runoff, which at this stage appears likely,
right,
what difference do you think it makes if Kemp is not on the ballot, the popular governor in Georgia, Kemp, is not on the ballot at the same time as Herschel Walker?
I think it makes a big difference. And I think the other thing that could make a big difference, the Republicans say, not the Democrats, the Republicans say that Donald Trump cost the Georgia Senate races. And if he's announced for president on November 15th, that's going to help us in the runoff. So he could cost them the Senate race again.
Well, there were hundreds of stories to come out of the hundreds of elections today, but we're going to try and pick out a few of the key ones. A number of endangered Democratic state governors have survived today. Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan is one of them, where there was also a ballot measure that Celinda referred to there to enshrine abortion rights in the state constitution. That has now also officially passed, so that will be added to the Michigan state constitution. In that neck of the woods as well, Democrat Tony Evers in Wisconsin, he's held on even though he was trailing Tim Michels, another Trump-backed candidate, in a number of recent polls. In fact, a number of Democrat senators who had looked in danger in polling in the last fortnight, like Maggie Hassan in New Hampshire, she had a comfortable win there at the same time as the Republican governor, Chris Sununu, had a very strong performance. So again, New Hampshire showing that they can happily vote on the same day, on the same ballot paper, for a Democrat in the Senate and a Republican in the governor's mansion. Meanwhile, amongst the Republican governors who the Democrats had once thought they could have a chance of knocking off, they basically all skated to victory. Again, that power of incumbency today. Greg Abbott in Texas, untroubled by his high-profile counterpart in Beto O'Rourke. Ron DeSantis, we've been talking about, absolutely walloping Charlie Crist in Florida by 20 points. Brian Kemp in Georgia, easily seeing off Stacey Abrams. And that is, to me, Chaz, one of the more fascinating results, given that we've got Brian Kemp winning that by about 8 points, whereas he only beat Stacey Abrams 4 years ago by 1.5 points. And so Democrats really thought after they won Georgia at the presidential level in 2020, Stacey Abrams would have a chance, and becoming governor of Georgia could be her becoming president or vice president in the next decade. That all seems to be off the table. But the get out the vote machine that she has helped to build in the last decade in Georgia, well, it seems to maybe be about to get Raphael Warnock over the line. So she's built this machine that just doesn't seem to work so much for her. Intriguing.
Well, I think we've also seen some big split tickets there. Like, for instance, Georgia, as you're saying, that Kemp was running, 8 points ahead of Herschel Walker.
Yeah.
You mentioned New Hampshire, Pennsylvania as well. We've seen, I thought 4 years ago, 6 years ago, we'd seen the end of split tickets. It was always just going to be partisan hacks, just against partisan hacks. But it seems that candidate quality still matters, at least to extent of maybe 10 points. And so that's interesting to me. Another thing that's interesting is the flip side of, well, actually, there were a few firsts I should mention as well before I do that, which is Maura Healey in Massachusetts, the first lesbian governor in America, and there might be a second one coming soon, who's still Tina Kotek in Washington. There's also the first undead senator. That's Chuck Grassley.
He's been undead for a long time. 89-year-old Chuck Grassley.
And people give crap to Joe Biden.
I'm not sure if that is the oldest re-election age for a senator. We've had senators like Strom Thurmond and Robert Byrd serving into their 90s before, but I'm not sure that Chuck Grassley may not have just claimed a little bit of history by being the oldest at 89.
He's nudging it.
And he won by 12 points over Mike Franken, the retired admiral that the Democrats put forward, a very centrist candidate. And they had high hopes that they could possibly snatch that away, largely because of Chuck Grassley's advanced age. But Chuck's done it again, double digits.
He has also another first, which we talked about ad nauseum during the last few months, and that is the first person to openly win election after a stroke. Some people might have had hidden strokes, but no one has campaigned saying, I have had a stroke, re-elect me, and been re-elected. And now we're talking about John Fetterman there in Pennsylvania.
Extraordinary. He suffered his stroke 4 days before the Democratic primary back in May. There were calls at the time from his Democrat rivals, including Connor Lamb, Malcolm Kenyatta, that Fetterman should drop out of the race. He said no. There'd been already a lot of early voting in that primary. He stuck it out, but then a couple of weeks ago when he appeared in that debate, it looked as though it had gone horribly wrong for him. He had a 10-point lead over Mehmet Oz in the poll average in September. By late October, after that debate, Mehmet Oz was in front. What we don't yet know is, was there a late swing back to Fetterman because he appeared with Obama over the weekend? He performed just fine. He was much better than he was in the debate, or were the polls wrong?
Wrong. That's the real question. I should say, by the way, as well, that there were some really interesting exit polls about Pennsylvania, which might have gone to the heart of the matter a little bit. If we have a look here from CNN, they asked, did Dr. Oz live in Pennsylvania long enough to represent it effectively? No. 56%. Now, John Fetterman did a lot of wacky, zany memes about that.
Yeah.
But maybe they worked.
Talking about Dr. Oz owning houses in 8 different states and being from New Jersey and all that kind of thing.
And the other thing I want to just focus on is the flip side to what you said before. You talked about Wisconsin, the Wisconsin governor winning and Maggie Hassan winning, but the other side were the people they're running against who are election deniers.
Yeah.
The people who are a little bit suspicious about elections, they got stomped. They really did. It's and you had Bolduc in New Hampshire, you had Tim Michaels, and in Arizona and Nevada they may still win, but they're underperforming from what the polls suggested they should.
Yeah, it's interesting on that because polls of Republican voters have said 63% of Republicans are election deniers. They believe Donald Trump's big lie that he had the 2020 election stolen away from him, that Joe Biden is not legitimately the president. So you can see why Republican candidates, particularly if they're wanting to get Donald Trump's endorsement, have had to buy into this fiction. It's a complete conspiracy theory, and yet they have bought into it. Now, I'm sure some of them do genuinely believe it, but I imagine there's a fair amount of cynicism there as well.
Well, we're about to find out more, because the book is not closed on that, because just today in Arizona, we found 20% of the polling machines were experiencing, as they say, technical issues with their tabulation machines. And look, I want to emphasise that the Arizona voters, they didn't have any stolen votes or lost votes. Everyone got to vote, okay? No one was robbed of a vote and there was no shenanigans going on. Didn't stop people like Kari Lake going on about it anyway. But it turned out in the end that what was actually going on was not a grand conspiracy, but that they needed to change the printer settings.
I feel your pain.
That resolved the issues. Now, you might not believe that. You might say it is just all a conspiracy theory, but I say you can trust the chairman of the elections board in Maricopa County in Arizona, because that man is Bill Gates.
Not the Bill Gates.
He's always giving back, isn't he? Anyway, so then Carrie Lake and Blake Masters, they went to a judge and they said, please give us another couple of hours of poll time to make up for it. And the judge said he was not going to. He refused it because he said there might have been some confusion and some difficulties, but there had not been any voters who were denied the opportunity to cast a ballot. Okay, that is true. But if Carrie Lake ends up losing, which she may or may not, it's really, really tight.
Yeah.
If she ends up losing, she is going to hullyboo all the way up to not just the Supreme Court. If she can find an interplanetary court in another galaxy, she will appeal to that. We are going to hear nothing but this for the next month if indeed she loses this race.
And even if she loses those court cases, this conspiracy theory has been further fueled because at that polling station in Maricopa County, you had a lot of people with their mobile phones. When we're talking about, again, 63% of Republicans already primed to believe that this thing is being stolen from them again. So they're filming this, and you've got some poor poll worker saying, look, it's okay, we just got to find, we've got to restart it and everything else. But no, everyone's going to be able to vote. It's okay. And within 10 minutes, that's on Fox News, and they're all saying, oh, they're doing it again. They're still in the election. This is terrible. Guys like James Woods are tweeting about it, the actor who's very pro-Trump. So it's the storyline is now out there. Fuel has been added to that fire. So whether there was a single missed vote, it looks like, no, there was not. But it doesn't matter. The genie is out of the bottle yet again, and I don't imagine we're going to see any reduction in the number of people on the Republican side who are saying, well, we thought we were going to win. We were told we were going to win a lot bigger than we did. There's something fishy going on here. That could well be the case. It could particularly affect the next race we're going to look at in the state of Georgia, Chaz, because back in 2021, you'll recall the Georgia runoff election for the 2 Senate seats at that time was held the day before the January 6th insurrection led by Donald Trump. And Donald Trump was campaigning for those Republican senators in Georgia, but he was mostly talking about how he had been robbed. And the net effect was a bunch of Republican voters stayed at home. They got disillusioned. Tia Mitchell is with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. She's their Washington correspondent. She's been covering this very close Senate contest in Georgia between the incumbent Democratic Senator, Reverend Raphael Warnock, and his Republican rival, the former football star, the Trump-backed Herschel Walker. Now, the latest numbers we saw from Casey at the top of the show has Raphael Warnock leading by just under 1 percentage point, but both of them are still about 1.5 percentage points below that 50% plus one threshold they would need to avoid another runoff election, which would be held in early December. And Tia told us that, well, folks in the state of Georgia will not be happy if they have to vote again in another month after another month of campaigning.
If it goes to a runoff, there won't be any other election in the nation, really, except for Georgia, as far as with national attention. So that just means even more ads, even more money, even more resources pouring into the state. And that's really going to mean voters in Georgia being inundated.
It seems to you there's an interesting disconnect between the vote for governor, where Governor Brian Kemp, a Republican, has won quite easily over his Democrat challenger Stacey Abrams. But about 1 in 10 Brian Kemp voters have flipped their vote in the Senate, it seems, to Raphael Warnock. What does that ticket splitting tell us?
Yeah, it tells us that particularly when it comes to Herschel Walker, he was not considered a strong candidate. Yes, the vast majority of Republicans still supported Herschel Walker, but he struggled to get those moderates. And of course, many Democrats weren't going to support him. So, there's a candidate quality issue there. He had a lot of controversies, but he came in very weak. He didn't have political experience. He didn't have much beyond popularity and name recognition. And so we're seeing that a lot of even conservative voters, moderate voters that maybe lean towards the Republican Party found it difficult to support a candidate who had so many controversies and was basically considered unprepared, not qualified for a Senate seat.
Now, there is still a scenario, Chaz, where the Democrats could get to, well, possibly 50 Senate seats, and Georgia could be a +1, or it could be the 50-50. We'll just have to wait and see what importance we ultimately see placed on that particular contest. Yeah. We've also been speaking today to Larry Sabato. You'll recall he is the director of the University of Virginia's Centre for Politics, and he is the owner, of course, of the famous Sabato's Crystal Ball. There it is. And Larry told us that overall Republicans have fallen short of his prediction of a net gain of 24 seats in the House and 1 in the Senate. And Larry also says that Democrats have a lot to gain if they can manage to hold on to a 50-50 Senate, where it is currently. And at that point, of course, it's Vice President Kamala Harris who can cast the tie-breaking vote.
If the Democrats can keep their 50-50 split, and that's the best they can do, I think, it will make a great deal of difference to Joe Biden. Just mentioning one, suppose there's a vacancy on the Supreme Court. If the Republicans gain even a 1-vote majority, there's a good chance that seat will be left open for 2 years. If the Democrats are in charge, even 50-50, there's a pretty good chance that Biden can find somebody that all of them could rally behind. That's just one example. There are so many. Remember, the Senate confirms all cabinet nominees and all of the other very significant nominations like ambassadors. If the Republicans control the Senate, many of those nominees will never see the light of day. If the Democrats have 50-50, the vast majority will be approved. So that one vote means a great deal. And right now, it can go either way. This is a long way from being decided. It will take many days of vote counting and then court appeals and all kinds of other things.
Larry's right about those appointments. They've got like 341 appointments still open, I believe, and 80 of them are judges. So there's a lot to be done. But on top of that, there's something which most people don't talk about, which is, I think, a bit of a hidden secret benefit to the Senate.
Do tell.
Which is that the Democrats have spent the last 3 years in Congress trying to get Trump's taxes.
Yes.
Well, as
tax returns.
His tax returns, yeah. As of last week, finally, Trump exhausted his last appeal and the Supreme Court said, okay, in the next couple of weeks, you have to give your taxes to Congress. And he just about waited it out. So the Congress didn't have any time to do anything with it when they finally got it. Now, if the Democrats keep a House, whether it be the House or the Senate, they can hold hearings about those tax returns. If Republicans take both houses, we're never going to see those tax returns ever again. So this could make a huge difference to Trump's nascent political campaign over the next few months, whether it's in the shadow of tax talk or not.
Interesting point. On the question of the Senate as well, I also think it's worth noting before we move on that Mandela Barnes in the state of Wisconsin, we saw from Casey at the top of the show that he's trailing Ron Johnson, who's a pretty colourful Republican incumbent. Ron Johnson, he is a fierce defender of Donald Trump. And a bit more even curiously aligned to Russia than Donald Trump has been at certain times as well. Mandela Barnes was trailing Johnson by double digits in some recent polls. Right now in late counting, he's only a bit over 1 percentage points behind. The Democratic Party machine basically turned the money tap off and were not helping Mandela Barnes. And particularly, he's from that Bernie Sanders progressive wing of the party, and there's a bit of discontent at the fact that some money was thrown into some races where Democrats really didn't have a chance, and they might have let that one slip through their fingers. If they still fall short in the Senate, they'll be ruining that decision, I'm sure. And
yet another example of conventional wisdom being smashed by these election results, because I'd already seen people start to say, well, we went too woke this time. Yep. We went too far left. We need to go moderate. And there was Mandela Barnes overperforming what people expected. It's going to take us a long time to read the tea leaves on this election. It was very confusing.
Yeah, indeed. Certainly in years to come, these 2022 midterm elections could be seen as the moment that Ron DeSantis announced himself as the next Republican president in waiting. Or, of course, we could be just saying, Ron, who was that again? What was that guy's name? But either way, DeSantis' 20-point thrashing of Charlie Crist in the Florida governor's race today is going to be sending a cold chill through the otherwise balmy air circling around Mar-a-Lago in Florida, Chaz, because Ron DeSantis suddenly looks like a rolled gold winner.
There is no doubt that Trump will have taken notice of that result. Because, and there's one stat which will sum it up, which is, you said 20% that Ron DeSantis won by this time?
Yeah.
Trump won by 3.5 points. That's quite a turnaround in 2 years, John. And the victory was a massive victory everywhere. Look at this map. See these red arrows? Each of them signifies a swing to Ron DeSantis since 2020, okay? The length of the arrow, the longer the arrow, the bigger the swing. There are massive swings all over Florida there, right across the entire Florida.
You sure that's not one of Donald Trump's weather maps? That's what it looks like to me.
It does have that sense. But anyway, but it's not just that he won everywhere, but he won over entire new demographics. Have a look at the exit polls from NBC on this one. Now, we're used to Cuban voters voting for Republicans, okay? 67% in 2018, 68% 22. That's not a surprise. The next one's a surprise. Puerto Ricans tend to vote for Democrats. Only 34% of them supported Ron DeSantis in 2018. This time, 55%. Other Latinos tend to support Democrats. 34% supported Ron DeSantis in 2018. This time, 50%. He's actually converting left-wing Latinos to vote for him. Now compare that performance, it was a powerhouse performance, to Trump during this midterms. He had a very limited role, but an almost entirely negative one. Basically, he endorsed a whole bunch of characters that Mitch McConnell was not a fan of at all. They were, let's say, unconventional characters. I've got a few of them here for you. We got J.D. Vance, Mehmet Oz, Adam Laxalt, Blake Masters and Herschel Walker. Now, J.D. Vance won.
Yep.
Sure, tick.
But a Republican should win in Ohio.
He should. Mehmet Oz lost. Republicans should have won that seat. The next three, we don't know. We don't know whether they're going to win or not, but all I know is that Republicans should have won all 5 of them in this election, and they may go 1 for 5. And if they go 1 for 5 or 2 for 4, people are going to remember that Donald Trump was the person responsible, and not just that he was responsible for them being there, but he didn't even support them when they got there. Mitch McConnell, who hated these candidates, spent $238 million in the key 7 Senate races, and I just listed 5 of them there, with his super PAC to support these candidates he didn't like. Trump raised $161 million during the same cycle, and he only spent $14 million supporting his own candidates. Now, that's across the 7 races. I just listed 5. All right, but then, after DeSantis got out and supported everyone, he supported all kinds of candidates. He was on tour, you know, like the Partridge Family. That's a great fresh reference. Yeah. Anyway, Trump started dive bombing the candidates who were trying to distance themselves from him, like Joe O'Dea in Colorado. And in fact, the first tweet, Trump was silent for the beginning of the night tonight when the Republicans weren't doing so well and when DeSantis was doing well. The first time he spoke was to trash a Republican who had just lost, which was Joe O'Dea in Colorado. Joe O'Dea lost big. Thanks for the contribution, Trumpy. So not only did Ron DeSantis perform incredibly well, but on top of that, he dug in deep for other Republicans, while Trump performed terribly and just trashed everyone else. I think that the Republicans, I don't think they're happy after this election, and I think they're looking for someone to blame, and I think they're going to blame him.
Well, one thing they will be happy with is Republicans won Miami-Dade County. That is the county in Florida when, up until, Obama won Florida. That was on the back of Democrats dominating the vote in Miami-Dade County. It's where Al Gore almost won the presidency in 2000, Miami-Dade. Well, that's flipped Republican now. So that is huge in terms of the bigger currents. The other thing, though, when you talked about the Puerto Rican vote going Republican, going DeSantis Republican rather than Trump Republican, hugely significant. We're talking about the impact of the hurricanes this season on the state of Florida. Of course, Puerto Ricans, very, very familiar with the impact of hurricanes, as are Cubans, of course. The expats are therefore very attuned to it. Often they have family members who are still on the islands, and so they're very concerned about it. When they saw Ron DeSantis handling this year's hurricane season like a grown-up, unlike Donald Trump, who went to Puerto Rico and threw paper towels at people in a way that looked a little bit let them eat cake. I think that had a major impact, and I think that will be a lasting image. Ron DeSantis, there was nothing sensational about the way that he handled the response, but he came across as competent, as a commander-in-chief who was on top of the brief, running all the levers of government, getting the emergency services in where they were needed. It was a risk for him. We saw what happened to George W. Bush when they got Katrina wrong. DeSantis got the hurricanes this year right, and it's paid off.
Yeah, whatever people think of him, whether they like him or hate him, everyone would agree he's solid and he's reliable in delivering what he usually delivers. He's consistent.
And dare I say it, Ron DeSantis looked more presidential in that moment than Donald Trump looked as president for 4 years.
You do dare say that.
I do dare say that, and I dare say that some Republicans will agree. Not all Republicans, of course. Republican strategist Ford O'Connell joined us a little earlier from the great state of Florida, where it is fair to say, all in all, they had a big night.
Well, over the last 6 years, we've had a 600,000 voter registration go towards the Republicans from the Democrats. So it's more than just the hurricane. It really has to do more with the COVID lockdowns. Florida is one of the first states to open, and a lot of people in Florida depend on tourism. So being locked down when you make money sort of under the table or week to week, it's not very good for a lot of people in Florida. So those governors who opened up early, whose states depend on tourism, were generally rewarded. We're probably going to see the same thing in Nevada with a Republican, and also Jared Polis, who's a Democrat in Colorado, a state that depends on tourism, is actually rewarded as well.
Ford, you've been in the business of advising presidential candidates in the past. Next week, former President Trump is likely to declare he's running. Would you be advising Ron DeSantis, tell you what, Governor, get out there tomorrow, announce you're running in 2024, it's your time?
Well, I'll say this. Whoever becomes the next Republican presidential nominee is going to be a Floridian. And I think the only question is really whether it's Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis. I think that Ron DeSantis is still trying to – his victory is so big right now, I don't think he wants to take away from that. I think he'd like to go on a victory tour. And if you're going to take on Donald Trump, I don't think you can just get out there on a moment's whim and do it, because Donald Trump's been preparing for this for 2 years.
Yeah, I like whether Ron DeSantis announces soon or wherever, he's clearly going to be a national figure at some point in time. I think that's clear. You've seen him up close. What do you know about Ron DeSantis that we might not know yet?
Well, in conservative circles, Ron DeSantis is known as America's governor. And the reason why is, one, Republicans were locked out of Washington. It's really the way he pushed back on the American medical community and the media during COVID, because in all honesty, the entire media apparatus in America was hammering Ron DeSantis for 2 years for how he handled COVID. And Ron was rewarded by Florida's constituents. And I think a lot of people are unhappy about that.
Ford, Donald Trump has always had this incredible knack at getting out Republican voters. The only people he gets out more than Republican voters is Democrat voters. How are you feeling about the double-edged sword that is Donald Trump being such a potentially dominant figure in the upcoming primaries?
Look, I think the best thing for Donald Trump, honestly, has been the last 2 years of the Joe Biden presidency. I mean, you just look at Joe Biden's disapproval numbers, and it's shown a lot of people, hey, you may not like the way Trump talks, but he actually delivers on many things that you care about, whether it's the economy, whether it's crime, whether it's border security, whether it's the Chinese Communist Party and oil production. Look, Donald Trump, I think, feels that this is his game to finish. And I think that, honestly, right now, he's the odds-on favorite to be the Republican nominee and the next president of the United States.
Ford, if the Republicans end up with a narrow majority in the House, what would your advice be to them how to play it? Do you think they should go the bipartisan legislation route, or do you think they should go the impeachment/hearing route, or is there some third way as well?
Well, here's what great question, Chaz. Here's what I would focus on. I would focus on two things: my money and my family. By my money, I mean the inflation, the economy. And my family, what I mean is issues like crime, border security, what's being taught in schools. The reason why I say that is these issues affect everyone, regardless of your gender or your political persuasion. And that's something that Democrats are finding out right now when it comes to the economy. Yes, they're making some holds in the Northeast, but it's not exactly the way they wanted it to go down because they're really not focused on the economy.
Ford, you know your history. First-term presidents losing the House 2 years in is not a predictor of their fortunes 2 years after that. Plenty come back and hold on to the White House. What would be the Democrats' best option, do you think, if they're to win in 2024? Stick with Biden, their only proven Trump killer, or should they be looking to turn that page and get somebody younger in there?
Well, I don't know what the Democrats are going to do, but the number one thing the Democrats have to figure out is how to get out of a recession, because you're absolutely right. Incumbent presidents traditionally do not lose unless they're mired in a recession. And one of the things we're seeing from the Democrats is the reason why they're losing, at least in these midterms, aside from history, is they're kind of tone deaf to those issues I was talking about: economy, inflation, and crime. And when they lose, later on when we certify the election results, I don't know that they necessarily got the message. So until they change what they're focused on, they're headed for a loss in 2024.
Okay, now I've referred to exit polls a few times during tonight's show, and if people have seen our previous election shows, they know I was being quite restrained, because normally I just go exit poll, exit poll, exit poll, exit poll. But there's kind of a move against exit polls, at least on election night. And the reason for that is because when they first poll you, when you come out of voting, they get a very select group of people who might not be representative at all. What they then do is they then compare to the overall vote and the overall numbers, and then they tweak it a bit.
The composition of the electorate.
Exactly. And then in the coming weeks, you have some kind of idea of the actual makeup of the electorate as opposed to exit polls. So do take with a little bit of a grain of salt some of the numbers I said, and I've held back a lot. I haven't even mentioned the black voters or the Latino voters. But now that's the exit polls. Eventually, you can work them out. The real question of this election campaign, I think it's one that the nerds are going to really get into, so why not us, because we're pretty nerdy, is the pre-polls, the polls going into it, because there's been a real issue. I don't need to tell you, 2016 was a real issue with polling, 2020 was a real issue with polling, 2018 not so bad, but there's been, what we've seen as a result of 2016 and 2020 is a lot of pollsters just leaving the industry entirely because it's expensive. It takes a long time to call lots and lots of people. Like I've told you on the show before, that the New York Times found they had to average 2 hours per successful call. And that just adds up for hundreds of thousands.
Well, if you want a sample size of at least 600, probably more like 1,000.
Yeah.
That is going to take you a very, very long time. And of course, the longer a poll takes, it becomes a very blurry snapshot, because you took 5 days to do this poll and things can shift in that time.
Totally. And if you get it right, you get one article out of it. If you get wrong, you get harassed for the... you're not hiding to nothing. Right. There's no point. And so what's happened is pollsters have dropped out. And this is the result. We've seen increasingly over time the number of midterm race polls decreasing. Now it's just over half what it was only a little bit over a decade ago. And it's not just that we're getting less polls, but the kind of polls, we're getting worse polls as well, because once again, there's no interest for a newspaper to do it. I'll tell you who's interested. The parties themselves are interested. Yep. And so as a result of that, look at this next graph. This is the percentage of polls for the Senate that are partisan. Over a third of them are now partisan. And we had this huge gap. We had a great test during this election where in the middle of October, we had this huge gap where the only polls that were being published were partisan polls. We spoke to one of those partisan pollsters ourselves, they're from Trafalgar, and they were getting different results to what the non-partisan pollsters were getting. Yep. And we asked ourselves, okay, who's right? Like, do these guys know the electorate? Do the partisan pollsters know the electorate better than the non-partisan pollsters? And what we found, at least from this election, is that the partisan pollsters got it kind of wrong, and didn't just get it wrong, but fooled all of us, because they affected 538's averages and Real Clear Politics' averages. 538, I rely on quite extensively, as you would know. And now they give partisan polls a lower weighting, but at the same time, it actually affects the information we get. Yep. And it's a bit of a brave new world with polling. And so what's the result of this? I think we now know that the non-partisan pollsters are valuable, but they're dying.
Yeah, and there's a big question as well. as to why any poll is being made public. If it's a poll that's been paid for by a media organisation and they've gotten a polling division of one of the universities, one of the major polling firms to do it, then, as you suggest, they're buying themselves a lead story often. Who's up, who's down, it becomes a horse race story. With the partisan pollsters, I'm not necessarily accusing them of putting out polls to achieve an objective, such as encourage their supporters or encourage their political party to pump more money into a race if it's suddenly looking a bit more competitive. You can if you say this is closer than we thought, we thought we're going to win this by 10 points, we're only 2 points in front, well, you'll suddenly find the Democratic or Republican Senate committee sends you a check for $10 million to buy a whole bunch of ads just to make sure of it. So sometimes they don't adjust their polls too much. They go, oh, well, we should acknowledge it. We'll put a margin of error on it, but we should acknowledge that it could be this close. And suddenly it's a 5-bell alarm. So you have to ask, what are the motivations behind these things? But ultimately, for campaigns themselves, increasingly it seems, whether it's Linda Lake or Sarah Longwell, other pollsters that we talk to, they're not doing percentage-based opinion polls. They are doing focus groups. They are getting representative individuals of the kinds of voters that are their key demographics. They want to know what white, working class, non-college educated men are thinking. They want to know what Hispanics from the islands rather than from South America are thinking on these issues. And they ask them those questions and they listen to those answers. That seems to be where the value is now, but it doesn't help guide the narrative in the media's, from the media's perspective, or indeed guide voters whether they think it's worth investing their money and their time in these campaigns.
Well, that might be the next wave of media polling equivalents or something, because I just do feel like we're coming to the end of an era here.
Yeah.
And I don't know where we go from here. But by the way, I don't want to accuse anyone of being malicious with their polls. I'm not suggesting that the partisan pollsters are trying to dodge the sample or something. I'm not suggesting anything like that at all.
A byproduct of this era of distrust in institutions and democracy itself is people do not want to talk to pollsters. They do not want to tell somebody they do not know at the other end of a telephone line or a text or an email what they think, how much money they make, where they live, and who they plan to vote for, because it could get hacked, it could get used against them, it could be monetised in some way. Our personal data is personal.
I'll tell you something interesting, because the New York Times has been obsessing over this as well, trying to get their polls accurate. They had 28% non-response gap from Republicans in one of their recent polls, and they were worried about it. So what they tried an experiment. They did a normal poll, and they did another poll at exactly the same time, same basic area of people, where they offered $25 for those people to fill out the poll, to give them some incentive. Do you know what happened? What the difference was between the two polls? Absolutely nothing.
How interesting.
So I don't know what to make of it. All I know is that we increasingly cannot trust the polls, and it's not because they're shysters or dodgy. It's just becoming very hard, and it's only becoming harder.
Yeah. The only thing I'd finally add to this is I do not get the impression that the Democrats who were sounding the alarm in the last couple of weeks that a red wave could be back on, it didn't seem to me as though they were making that up. No. They weren't just looking at partisan polls or the few public polls. They had their own data that said, we're in trouble here, and the kind of message management that was coming out of, whether it's Nancy Pelosi or the White House over the weekend, they were expecting to probably lose 25 seats in the House.
They definitely believed it. They're doing postmortems.
Right.
Publicly. They clearly believed it.
Yeah. So that they don't have good data either is intriguing, because it means that we're seeing, well, cases like Wisconsin, where there was the polls were wrong, and they missed out on possibly winning a winnable seat because they didn't invest in it, because they didn't realise how close it was. Let's get another perspective for you now, though. We did speak earlier to Republican Lan He-Chen. He's been on Planet America a number of times over the years. He's principally known for being a senior policy advisor to Mitt Romney during his 2012 presidential campaign. Well, Lan He says that Republicans are probably not feeling too great about today's result, in the Senate in particular.
I think some of these Senate races will be a disappointment. I think what we're seeing in Pennsylvania, for example, I think people expected that would be competitive, but I think there was a sense that amongst Republicans, that was going to be an opportunity to hold on to that seat. I think there's other races where Republicans had hoped to be more competitive, for example, in Colorado. With Joe O'Dea, who was a great candidate. So I think it's a mixed bag, but obviously taking back the House is something that Republicans will be pleased about, and we'll have to see how the Senate turns out here. Many more races still to be decided.
Whenever you get a mixed bag, people will pick things out selectively and say, here's the big takeaway. Some will point to Trump-endorsed candidates like Mehmet Oz and say, well, this is a bad night to be Donald Trump. He's lost his magic touch. Is that a fair takeaway?
I'm not sure it is. I mean, obviously, I think we could go back and say if you had a Dave McCormick running in Pennsylvania instead of an Oz, would that have made the difference? Perhaps. It's easy enough to have these scenarios. I do think it's the case that candidate quality matters a lot. And I think in a few of these races, frankly, the less attractive candidate made it out. So I think that has an impact. Competitive primaries also have an impact, John. I mean, if you have a competitive primary, it puts you in a tougher position when you have to run a very, very tough general election in a purple state, whether it's Arizona, Pennsylvania. I think we're seeing a similar dynamic play out in a number of other places. But it's whether it was because of Trump's pick, or because you've just got people who are less attractive as candidates generally because of their profile, or just the fact that they had a competitive primary, I think it's hard to discern what the bigger takeaway is at this early point.
Len He, as a Republican who has been prepared at times to lend their expertise to the other side, you worked for Barack Obama, you're sought out by the other side on issues. Are you heartened when you see people splitting their ticket and saying, you know what, I like Brian Kemp as a Republican governor in Georgia, but I also like Democrat Raphael Warnock as our senator, certainly better than I like the look of Herschel Walker. That's fairly significant that 10% of the population is prepared to say, no, I can be for both sides at once.
Yeah, I mean, even in my own race, we're seeing probably about 6 to 7% of people split their tickets, which is a remarkable thing when you think about how easy it is just to vote one party all the way down the ballot. I've always believed, you've got to evaluate candidates based on who they are, what they stand for, and where they're going, as opposed to just partisan labels. That's becoming increasingly harder in a lot of ways as our politics in the U.S. become more balkanized, become more partisan. So I think the fact that you're seeing that happening in a lot of different places, Pennsylvania is another place where I think we've seen some ticket splitting as well, potentially. I think it's probably a good thing for the system generally that we're seeing that kind of activity happening.
Well, we've got just over a minute to go, Chaz. I guess in that time we should say, what happens next?
Okay, well, regardless of the election, tomorrow they're going to start talking about the debt ceiling. And what I mean by that is halfway through next year, America is going to hit the so-called debt ceiling where they're going to need permission to pay any more of their debts from Congress. Mm-hmm. It's now apparent that the Republicans are going to, even if only by 1 or 2 seats, they're going to take Congress, which means they're going to need Republicans' permission, the Democrats, in order to lift the debt ceiling. And they're not going to get it. We all know they're not going to get it.
So they're going to do it now.
They're going to do it now. But Joe Manchin, the 50th vote in the Senate, is being a bit ornery, like Joe Manchin is. The negotiations are going to start now because they're going to be desperate to pass it in this next month. Otherwise, they might default on their debt, and then that's going to be bad news for any Democrat in 2024.
And then we'll see whatever else they try and shoehorn through in this lame duck session, because the new Congress doesn't get sworn in until early January. So there is a bit of trash they can potentially take out. And then, of course, I don't know, Donald Trump's going to declare he's running next week, probably. If there is, we'll probably do a special show for you. And goodness knows what Joe Biden's going to do. Is he going to run again? Is he not going to run again?
We'll find out.
So much to look forward to. We've got a couple more shows. That's it for this special edition of Planet America. We'll see you back at the regular time on Monday night on ABC TV.
And you can catch up on iView, YouTube and Facebook. And don't forget the Pet Podcast on Friday for even more midterm madness. It's so geeky.
See you later.
Bye.
In the final episode...
Hello, everyone.
What time is it, Magda? We'll have to see the principal after this, I think.
Magda explores an alarming new trend.
Seen lots of people struggle and not get any help.
I don't think governments understand the scale of it.
And discovers the link between our physical and mental health.
The quality of our diets is linked to our risk for depression.
Really?
You're not looking for the pleasure or the taste of the food, you're looking for relief.
Magda's Big National Health Check, Tuesday 8:30 on ABC TV. Victoria's state election is on, and ABC